Almost everything commonly taught about reading an avoidant man's feelings is unreliable, and most of it was never designed with his specific psychology in mind to begin with. Jealousy gets treated as proof of investment. Physical affection gets treated as proof of closeness. Even the words themselves, the phrase declaring love out loud, get treated as the gold standard of confirmation. And for most people, most of the time, these signals do mean something close to what they appear to mean. But an avoidant man's internal wiring works differently enough that almost every one of these commonly trusted signals becomes, at best, ambiguous, and at worst, actively misleading. There is, however, one sign that cuts through all of that ambiguity, one behaviour that an avoidant man's conscious defences were never actually built to guard against, because it doesn't arrive as a declaration at all. It arrives sideways, unplanned, almost accidentally, in moments so ordinary that neither person usually even notices it happening. What follows is an explanation of exactly what that sign is, why it works when so many other, more commonly cited signs fail, and how to recognise it clearly, rather than mistaking something else, something more superficial and considerably less reliable, for the real thing. Anyone listening who has spent time trying to decode an avoidant man's feelings through the usual channels, watching for jealousy, waiting for grand declarations, counting how often he initiates contact, only to end up more confused rather than less, deserves to understand why those channels were never going to provide reliable information in the first place, and what actually does. It's worth acknowledging too how exhausting this particular kind of guessing game tends to become over time. Watching for signs, weighing every gesture against every silence, trying to build a coherent picture out of information that was never designed to fit together cleanly in the first place. This exhaustion is a completely reasonable response to a genuinely confusing situation, not a sign of overthinking or excessive vigilance. The confusion was real, produced by the mismatch between commonly trusted signals and how this specific attachment style actually operates. And anyone who has felt worn down by trying to solve that mismatch deserves to hear that the difficulty wasn't imagined or self-created. Before revealing the sign itself, it's worth walking through why the commonly trusted indicators fail so consistently when applied to avoidant men specifically. Because understanding the failure of these more obvious signals is what makes the actual, reliable sign so much easier to trust once it's explained clearly. It's worth naming, briefly, why so much popular advice on this topic leans so heavily on these unreliable signals in the first place. Because understanding that context helps explain why this confusion is so widespread, rather than being some kind of individual failure to read a specific person correctly. Most general relationship advice is built around assumptions that hold reasonably well for people with more secure attachment patterns, where outward expression and internal feeling tend to align fairly closely most of the time. Applying that same advice, largely unchanged, to someone whose internal experience and outward expression diverge considerably more often, produces exactly the kind of persistent confusion this exploration has been addressing throughout. It isn't that anyone applying this advice was doing anything wrong. It's that the advice itself was never actually calibrated for the specific psychology being discussed here. Consider jealousy first, since it's probably the most commonly cited signal people rely on to gauge emotional investment. The assumption is straightforward enough. If he gets visibly bothered by another man's attention toward you, that discomfort must indicate how much he cares. This assumption holds up reasonably well for most people, but it becomes considerably less reliable when applied to avoidant men, because jealousy, for someone with this particular attachment style, doesn't map cleanly onto depth of feeling the way it does for people with more secure or even anxious attachment patterns. An avoidant man can experience jealousy rooted almost entirely in wounded ego or a general discomfort with unpredictability, entirely separate from any deep emotional attachment to the specific person involved. He might feel a flash of possessiveness about someone he has no genuine emotional investment in whatsoever, simply because possessiveness, for him, often operates more as a reflex tied to control and self-image than as a direct expression of love. Meanwhile, he might feel almost no visible jealousy at all regarding someone he's actually fallen deeply for, precisely because deep attachment tends to trigger his defensive withdrawal mechanisms rather than his possessive ones, pulling him toward emotional distance rather than toward visible, jealous reactivity. This is worth sitting with because it inverts a widely held assumption in a way that causes a great deal of unnecessary confusion. The absence of jealousy in an avoidant man is not reliable evidence of the absence of deep feeling, and its presence is not reliable evidence of deep feeling either. It's simply too tangled up with separate, unrelated psychological material, ego, control, unpredictability tolerance, to function as a clean signal of attachment on its own. Consider physical affection next, another commonly cited signal that turns out to be far less reliable than most people assume. The logic here seems intuitive. Physical closeness requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires trust, so more physical affection should indicate more emotional investment. This logic breaks down specifically with avoidant men because physical affection and emotional intimacy, for someone with this attachment style, often operate as two almost entirely separate channels, rather than as naturally connected expressions of the same underlying feeling. An avoidant man can be quite physically affectionate, even in relationships carrying relatively little emotional depth, because physical closeness doesn't necessarily require the same kind of exposure that emotional vulnerability does. It can even function, for some avoidant men, as a substitute for emotional intimacy, a way of maintaining connection and closeness without ever having to engage with the more threatening territory of genuine emotional exposure. Conversely, an avoidant man experiencing genuine, deep emotional attachment might actually become somewhat more physically reserved during periods of particular internal intensity, not because attraction or affection has diminished, but because the emotional exposure underneath the relationship has become significant enough to trigger some withdrawal across multiple channels simultaneously, physical included. This means physical affection, like jealousy, simply doesn't track reliably with depth of emotional investment for this particular attachment style, and relying on it as a primary signal tends to produce exactly the kind of confusion so many people report when trying to read an avoidant partner's feelings. Consider verbal declarations as well, since they might seem like the most obvious, most direct signal available, the actual words expressing love or commitment spoken out loud. This is perhaps the most misleading signal of all when it comes to avoidant men specifically, and understanding why requires revisiting something already touched on in other explorations of avoidant psychology. Avoidant men, more than almost any other group, tend to carry a deep, often unconscious skepticism toward declarations in general, partly because their own internal experience has taught them that words and follow-through frequently diverge, and partly because declaring feelings out loud requires exactly the kind of direct, unguarded vulnerability their entire defense structure is organized around avoiding. This creates a genuinely counterintuitive dynamic worth naming clearly. An avoidant man's willingness to say the actual words doesn't correlate as reliably with depth of feeling as most people assume, and in some cases, it can even correlate inversely. Some avoidant men become more willing to offer verbal declarations, specifically in situations carrying lower emotional risk, when the relationship feels safely casual enough that the words themselves don't threaten to open a door toward the kind of sustained intimacy they're not prepared to walk through. Paradoxically, the deeper and more threatening the actual feeling becomes, the more likely he may be to withhold the words entirely, precisely because saying them out loud would make the feeling undeniable, both to the person hearing them and, more importantly, to himself. This is worth pausing on because it explains something that confuses a great many people trying to understand an avoidant partner's silence around this specific topic. The absence of the words is not reliable evidence of the absence of the feeling. It's often closer to the opposite, evidence that the feeling has become significant enough to require active suppression rather than casual, low-stakes expression. Having walked through why these three commonly trusted signals, jealousy, physical affection, and verbal declaration, all fail to reliably indicate genuine emotional attachment in avoidant men, it's worth addressing two additional commonly cited signals before turning to the one that actually works, because these two in particular tend to generate a great deal of false confidence when relied upon in isolation. The first involves being introduced to an avoidant man's friends, family, or broader social circle, often treated as a significant milestone, signaling serious intent. This signal carries more weight than jealousy or physical affection, and it isn't entirely without merit, but it remains considerably less reliable than most people assume, because the motivation behind these introductions varies enormously and doesn't always track cleanly with depth of emotional attachment. Some avoidant men introduce partners to their social circle relatively easily and early, not because the relationship carries unusual emotional significance, but because these introductions don't actually require much vulnerability on their part. Attending a gathering together or meeting a sibling in passing doesn't necessarily demand the kind of direct emotional exposure that genuinely threatens an avoidant man's defenses. It can happen almost logistically, a natural byproduct of two lives overlapping, without reflecting much about the depth of feeling underneath it. Conversely, an avoidant man experiencing genuinely deep attachment might actually delay these introductions longer than expected, not because the relationship matters less, but because introducing someone to his inner circle can feel like a public, semi-formal declaration, precisely the kind of conscious, deliberate exposure his defenses are specifically organized around avoiding. The delay, in this case, reflects the significance of the relationship rather than its absence. Another example of how an avoidant man's behaviour can run precisely opposite to what conventional wisdom would predict. The second additional signal worth addressing involves frequency of contact and small acts of service. How often he texts, how quickly he responds, how readily he offers to help with practical tasks or errands. This signal, like the others, seems intuitively reliable, but breaks down considerably upon closer examination. Frequency of contact often reflects an avoidant man's current capacity for engagement at any given moment, shaped by circumstances entirely unrelated to how he feels about a particular relationship, workload, mood, unrelated stress, general communication habits developed long before this particular relationship even began. Acts of service, similarly, can reflect a general personality trait or a habitual way of expressing care that remains fairly consistent across multiple relationships, regardless of how deeply he's actually attached to the specific person receiving them. This doesn't mean these signals carry no information whatsoever. It means they carry considerably less reliable information than most people assume, easily confounded by unrelated factors that have nothing to do with the underlying depth of emotional attachment being investigated. Relying on any of these signals in isolation, jealousy, physical affection, verbal declaration, social introductions, or contact frequency, tends to produce exactly the kind of confusing, contradictory picture so many people report when trying to understand an avoidant partner's actual internal experience. It's worth turning now to the one sign that actually does work consistently, and understanding why it works requires looking closely at how an avoidant man's defenses are actually structured, rather than how most people assume they're structured. An avoidant man's defenses are built almost entirely around guarding conscious, deliberate expressions of vulnerability. This means his internal filtering system is highly effective at catching and suppressing anything that registers, even faintly, as a direct declaration of feeling, need, or attachment, saying the words, making a grand gesture, explicitly discussing the future of the relationship in a formal, deliberate way. All of these pass through a filter specifically designed to catch and minimize exactly this kind of content, which is precisely why relying on these more obvious signals produces such unreliable results. But this filtering system, as thorough as it is regarding deliberate, conscious expression, has a significant blind spot, and this blind spot is exactly where the one reliable sign lives. The filter doesn't catch small, unplanned, offhand references to a shared future, especially when those references occur inside completely mundane, low-stakes contexts, rather than inside moments explicitly framed as significant or relationship-defining. This is the sign. An avoidant man who has developed genuine, deep emotional attachment will begin, without planning to, and often without noticing he's doing it, folding the other person into his imagined future in small, unremarkable, offhand ways, embedded inside ordinary conversation about ordinary things, rather than announced as any kind of deliberate commitment or declaration. This might sound abstract described this way, so it's worth making it more concrete. This sign shows up as a passing reference to some future activity, event, or plan, mentioned casually, almost incidentally, with the other person's presence simply assumed as part of it, without any of the deliberate weight or framing that would accompany an actual, conscious declaration about the relationship's future. It's the difference between formally discussing where the relationship is headed. A conversation an avoidant man's defences are highly equipped to deflect, delay, or avoid entirely, and casually mentioning something months away as though the other person's presence in that future moment is simply an unquestioned, assumed fact, requiring no discussion or negotiation at all because it never occurred to him, in that specific moment, that it might be otherwise. There's a metaphor worth holding here. Picture someone standing guard at a heavily fortified entrance, trained extensively to identify and stop anyone attempting to enter through the front gate, watching that single point of entry with intense, focused vigilance. This guard is remarkably effective at their singular job, stopping anything that approaches directly, announced and visible. But this same fortress often has small, unguarded openings elsewhere, gaps in the wall nobody thought to reinforce, precisely because all the attention and resources went toward defending the obvious, expected point of entry. Small, unplanned truths about an avoidant man's actual feelings tend to slip through exactly these unguarded gaps, not because his defences have weakened, but because his defences were never built to guard against something this small, this casual, and this unintentional in the first place. This explains why this particular sign tends to be so much more reliable than anything requiring conscious, deliberate expression. It bypasses the filtering system entirely, not by overwhelming it, but by simply falling below the threshold that system was designed to detect. An avoidant man's conscious mind is watching for grand gestures and direct declarations, prepared to intercept and manage anything that resembles either. It is not watching for a small, throwaway comment about something months away that happens to include the other person's presence as an unquestioned assumption, because that kind of comment doesn't register as vulnerability requiring management. It simply slips out, revealing something his more guarded, deliberate communication would never allow to surface directly. It's worth naming, clearly, why this specific kind of slip carries so much more reliable weight than a deliberate declaration might, even though it initially seems like a smaller, less significant gesture by comparison. Deliberate declarations can be performed, calculated, or offered strategically, sometimes even by people whose underlying feelings don't actually match the words being used. This is true for people generally, not just avoidant men specifically. Unplanned, unconscious inclusion in an imagined future is considerably harder to fake, precisely because it requires no conscious intention at all. It simply reflects what's actually happening inside someone's mind when they're not actively managing or filtering their own thoughts, which makes it a far more trustworthy window into genuine internal experience than anything requiring deliberate, conscious articulation. There's a cognitive dimension worth explaining here as well, because it helps clarify why this particular kind of unplanned slip carries such reliable psychological weight, distinct from simply being a nice theory about behaviour. Human cognition generally involves a great deal of automatic, unconscious processing, running constantly beneath conscious awareness, quietly shaping assumptions, expectations, and mental models that inform behaviour long before any of it rises to the level of deliberate, conscious thought. This automatic processing tends to leak into speech in small, unplanned ways, precisely because it operates outside the reach of whatever conscious filtering system a person uses to manage what they say and reveal deliberately. This phenomenon isn't unique to avoidant men, and it isn't some kind of exotic psychological quirk. It reflects a fairly well-established feature of how human language and cognition generally interact. Unplanned speech, often revealing underlying mental models more accurately than carefully planned, deliberate speech does, precisely because deliberate speech passes through layers of conscious editing that unplanned speech simply bypasses. What makes this particularly significant in the specific context being explored here is simply how much more heavily an avoidant man's conscious filtering operates compared to most people's, given how much of his conscious communication style has been built specifically around managing and minimizing vulnerable content before it ever reaches expression. This means the gap between what leaks through unconsciously and what gets expressed consciously tends to be considerably wider for an avoidant man than it would be for someone whose conscious communication style doesn't carry the same heavy filtering burden. This explains why this particular sign functions as such a reliable indicator specifically for this attachment style. Even though similar unplanned slips exist, to some degree, in almost everyone's speech patterns generally, for someone without heavy conscious filtering around vulnerability, unplanned speech and deliberate speech tend to align relatively closely, meaning there's less additional information gained by paying special attention to the unplanned category specifically. For an avoidant man, whose deliberate speech has been so heavily filtered and managed, the gap between what he says on purpose and what slips out unintentionally becomes considerably wider and considerably more informative, precisely because so much of his authentic internal experience gets held back from ever reaching his more conscious, managed communication in the first place. It's worth naming too why this specific kind of slip tends to happen more often during particular kinds of moments, rather than uniformly across all contexts. Because recognizing when this sign is most likely to appear helps clarify how to notice it without having to search constantly or anxiously for it. This unconscious inclusion tends to surface most reliably during periods of genuine relaxation, moments when an avoidant man's usual vigilance has naturally lowered, simply because the immediate context doesn't feel like it requires active defense. Ordinary, low-stakes conversation, shared quiet activity, moments of genuine ease, rather than moments carrying any explicit relational significance or pressure. This makes sense given everything already explored about how his filtering system operates, primarily oriented toward guarding against perceived threats to his emotional safety. When no such threat is actively being perceived, because the moment feels genuinely unremarkable and low stakes, the filtering system simply isn't as actively engaged, creating more opportunity for unplanned, revealing content to surface naturally. This has an important practical implication worth naming clearly. This sign is far more likely to appear during genuinely relaxed, unpressured moments than during moments explicitly focused on discussing the relationship itself, which tend to activate exactly the kind of conscious vigilance that suppresses this particular pattern from surfacing at all. Ironically, this means that deliberately creating space for serious, direct conversation about the relationship's future, while valuable and necessary for entirely separate reasons, is actually one of the least likely contexts in which to observe this particular sign appearing naturally. The sign tends to live in the ordinary, unremarkable spaces of a relationship, not in its more deliberately significant moments. There's something important worth validating here for anyone listening who has noticed this exact pattern in an avoidant partner's behaviour. Small, offhand references to shared future moments, mentioned so casually they were almost easy to miss entirely, while grand declarations or explicit conversations about the relationship's future remained conspicuously absent. This pattern, confusing as it might have felt in the moment, especially set against the more commonly discussed advice emphasizing explicit communication and clear declarations as the gold standard for gauging investment, is genuinely significant. It reflects something his more guarded, deliberate communication was actively working to prevent him from expressing directly. It's worth being precise about what distinguishes this sign from something that might resemble it superficially, but doesn't actually carry the same significance, because precision matters enormously here. The sign being described isn't simply an avoidant man discussing future plans in general. Discussing logistics, scheduling, or practical arrangements doesn't necessarily indicate anything about emotional attachment, since these conversations often happen out of simple practical necessity, regardless of the underlying relationship's depth. What distinguishes the genuine sign is the specific combination of casualness and unconscious assumption, a reference to something future-oriented, made without deliberate framing or discussion, where the other person's continued presence simply gets assumed as an unquestioned fact, rather than something requiring negotiation, confirmation, or explicit inclusion. This distinction matters because it's easy to search for confirmation of this sign so eagerly that ordinary, practically motivated future discussion gets mistaken for the deeper, more significant pattern being described here. The genuine sign carries a particular emotional texture, an unplanned, almost surprised quality, sometimes even a slight hesitation or correction immediately afterward, as though some part of the avoidant man's conscious mind caught up to what had just slipped out and felt a flicker of discomfort about it. This slight, almost imperceptible self-correction, when it appears, actually reinforces rather than undermines the significance of what was said, because it reveals that the comment registered as meaningful, even to the avoidant man himself, meaningful enough to trigger a small wave of his usual defensive discomfort once his conscious awareness caught up to what his unguarded mind had already assumed. It's worth addressing something practical here, because recognizing this sign accurately naturally raises a question about how to actually respond to it in the moment it occurs. And mishandling that moment can sometimes undo whatever ease allowed the sign to surface in the first place. The most effective response tends to involve almost nothing at all, at least not immediately. Drawing sudden, explicit attention to an unplanned comment, pointing it out directly, asking him to confirm or elaborate on what he meant, tends to trigger exactly the kind of conscious vigilance that made the moment revealing in the first place. Once he becomes consciously aware that something vulnerable just slipped out, his usual filtering system tends to re-engage quickly, sometimes producing an immediate retreat or a minimizing correction that erases whatever ease had allowed the comment to surface naturally. This doesn't mean the sign should be ignored or dismissed. It means it's best received quietly, internally, allowed to register as genuine information without requiring immediate acknowledgement or discussion in the moment it occurs. Over time, as this pattern repeats across multiple separate occasions, it becomes reasonable and often healthy to eventually address it directly, though even then, this is best done gently, framed with curiosity rather than triumph or demand, avoiding anything that might feel like presenting evidence in a case being built against him. The goal was never surveillance, and treating this pattern as ammunition in an argument about his feelings tends to undermine the very trust that allowed this kind of unguarded moment to happen in the first place. There's something worth naming about timing here as well, because patience matters considerably in how this entire process unfolds. A single instance of this sign, however meaningful, doesn't necessarily warrant any kind of direct conversation at all. It's the accumulation, the repeated pattern across many separate, unplanned moments over meaningful time that eventually earns a more direct conversation, one approached carefully, gently, and without pressure. Ideally initiated during another one of those same relaxed, low-stakes moments where his usual defenses tend to be least active in the first place. This measured approach matters because rushing to confront or celebrate this sign the moment it first appears risks treating a genuine, quiet piece of information as though it were a finish line rather than simply one useful data point among several that, together, help build a more accurate picture of what's actually happening beneath an avoidant man's guarded exterior. Patience here isn't passivity. It's simply an accurate response to how this particular pattern actually needs to be observed and understood over time in order to be trusted with real confidence. It's worth addressing something important here, because this entire explanation could easily be misapplied if taken as a search for a single moment that, once found, guarantees a specific outcome. This particular sign, however reliable it is as an indicator of genuine underlying attachment, doesn't function as a promise regarding what an avoidant man will actually do with that attachment moving forward. It reveals something real and significant about his internal experience in a given moment. It does not reveal whether he possesses, or will ever develop, the actual capacity to act consistently on that internal experience, showing up, communicating clearly, and building the kind of relationship such genuine attachment would seem to deserve. This distinction between revealing genuine feeling and predicting genuine capability deserves to be held clearly throughout everything explored here, echoing something worth restating in this specific context as well. Recognizing this sign accurately offers real, valuable information about where an avoidant man's internal world actually stands. Considerably more reliable information than jealousy, physical affection, or even his own explicit words might offer. It does not offer a guarantee, a timeline, or a reason to wait indefinitely for that internal reality to eventually translate into consistent, secure, visible commitment.